I'm going to say a few words at the beginning just to tell you sort of my own story about how I came across Tim and how that sort of made me work at The Guardian. And then I was going to basically spend about 40 minutes or so talking to him here, and then it's up to you for questions. So do think of things, anything. I think there's not one subject in the world I've ever heard Tim get stumped on. So if you can do it today, and I encourage you to, this will be a first, and it will be written down in history. So Tim Radford is what you might call a modern-day polymath, Renaissance man. He's written commentary about theatre and film, met Andrew Tartowski and Primo Levi. Oh, and also he's had a career for more than 2 decades with science too. Many of the great science editors and reporters that you'll all have heard of got their first break under Tim's patronage. And as a baby reporter myself, I remember sending him an email asking for some advice at a time when I never thought that my career was going to amount to very much. Hold your thoughts there about whether it has or not. Never once thinking he'd actually reply. He did reply, and he said to me to give him a call whenever I was free. I thought I'd strike while the iron was hot, but I was actually abroad at the time, and I couldn't actually afford the phone call from the hotel. But I thought, he's busy, he's not going to have much time, so 5 minutes, how much would that cost? I picked up the phone and said hello. 40 minutes later, I hadn't said much else. I was $75 down, extortionate phone bill, thanks to him, but I was infinitely richer. I had the pleasure then of sitting next to Tim for more than 2.5 years at Farringdon Road, where our office was before we moved, and he talked without stopping for almost that entire time. I've never heard a story twice, though. I've listened to anecdotes about the time he met, as you say, very famous actors, directors, scientists, or going on field trips to Moscow where there were spies involved. I listened to him, and I say this in inverted commas, interviewing scientists, somehow explaining their own work to him as they'd never thought to describe it. And here's my favourite line that Tim ever wrote. It was in a book review, which just goes to show to you just how powerful some of the stuff he writes is. It was a review of The Goldilocks Enigma by Paul Davis, another one of my favourites from science writers. I'm sure that many of you know his work. And it goes like this. The universe is an open book, but only open at the present page. The authorship is permanently in dispute, and no one will ever see the dust jacket or decipher the opening sentences. The entire narrative trajectory must be constructed from the lethargic action, incidental characters, and indeterminate location visible right now. Nevertheless, in the past 40 years, physicists have put together a story so far that confidently describes almost the entire history of that last 13.7 billion years. There is a catch. They don't know what happened at the very beginning. They have no idea why the story is at all legible, and they don't understand why the book has any readers. Now, there's almost no scientific language in there, but it tells you everything you need to know about the beginning of the universe. And so I'm very pleased to be interviewing Tim on stage now, or rather on the floor here. I'm going to take your seat. Now, Tim, as we all know, you started life in New Zealand. Tell us about those early years. What were you reporting back then?
I got sick of school, as people do at 16, and walked out. And this was a different world. It was a world of full employment. So people said, "You're good at English, perhaps you should be a teacher." And they said, "Oh, he could be a journalist." And I thought, that's the one. And rushed off to the New Zealand Herald and said, "Get us a job." And they said, "Can you start Monday?" And the next thing I knew, I was a shipping reporter. It was the job that nobody wanted. It was the despised job. In fact, very old journalists here, if there are any, will remember that a phrase around in journalism was, "I covered the waterfront." That is, I did all the crap jobs there were, and the waterfront, funnily enough, was one of them. And this was a waterfront which, if you go and see Marlon Brando's On the Waterfront, you will actually get a fairly accurate picture of what it was like. People walked around, people unloaded cargo with hooks, and they swung on derricks and went down in holds, or they fell down holds. And one of my jobs as a reporter, apart from ringing around everybody, because there were no public relations officers, you just had to ring up people to find out. You had to ring up shipping companies to find out what ships were coming in. I would go out on the pilot boat at 5 o'clock in the morning, wearing my trench coat and my brown shoes, and after about 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, pitching up and down, we'd meet a liner, and then you'd have to jump onto a rope ladder and shin up the side of the thing, and then go to the captain's cabin and knock on his door and say, "Good morning, it's the press. Have you got any famous people on board?" And he'd say, oh, we've got Robert Mitchum in stateroom 1. And then you'd go and knock on Robert Mitchum's door and say, what do you think of New Zealand, Mr. Mitchum? And he'd say, oh, I haven't seen it yet. And, conversations were strangely infantile. But of course, I was 16, so I feel no need to apologise for being adolescent at that time.
The interesting thing, of course, is that, and I don't mean to sort of belay the 60s here, but at that time, this is how famous film stars went around the world. This is how famous people went around the world.
Yeah,
it wasn't planes all the time.
Let me tell you, this was before the jet. The word jet set was an indicator of glamour when it turned up. And
how long did you do that before actually getting into maybe another role there at the paper?
Well, you very quickly you chase in a newspaper. Very quickly you do what's called chasing fire engines. If there's a story around, you go for it. And every reporter I knew actually went to work with a notebook, a pencil, and tuppence for the phone. Tuppence for the phone was where you actually had to try and find a public phone box that hadn't been vandalised to phone your story through, because getting back to the office was a problem. Although this was in the days of antediluvian hot metal. This was Gutenberg just improved slightly. This is when people actually set newspapers in hot metal, and then they set the rules, and then they got a chase out, and they composed the thing with apparent painstaking care, and then produced a newspaper. And they started doing that about 10 o'clock at night for a morning newspaper. I mean, you could get stories into a paper, the first edition of a paper, at 10 o'clock at night. So if you worked for a morning paper, you started work at 2 in the afternoon mostly, and worked till 11, or carried on till 3 if there were, for the second and third editions.
So what happened if things changed overnight? Did they remake those plates? They remade those plates?
Oh yeah, remake the whole thing. Yeah, so it was, by the way, it was much, much faster than new technology. This is the paradox of Gutenberg, is that although it was Columbia School of Journalism, the Guardian was the last paper to switch directly from hot metal to computer production, and Columbia School of Journalism used to bring their students in to laugh. But of course, when they saw how quickly we could change a story on edition with hot metal, they didn't laugh quite so much, because one of the features of new technology is that it actually has just brought deadlines earlier and earlier, and Alok and I couldn't get a story in after 5 o'clock most nights.
So this is the first few years as you learned. What kinds of things were you learning that you didn't realise you were learning at the time, but then you look back and you thought, well, that's a useful skill as a journalist?
Okay, I learned to listen. Don't just listen to what they say, try and listen to what they mean as well. There are always two things going on when someone talks. Quite often you find politicians will use the wrong words. If you tape them and play the tape back, you'll find that they're talking flatulent rubbish. But actually, you knew what they meant. So when you're reporting, you have to listen very carefully to two things. You're listening for words that you can quote accurately, and you're listening for the first sentence of your article. The bit that's going to make the reader read the second sentence, which of course is your only ambition in life.
And when you were doing all of this, did you have a plan? Did you think one day I want to get to a national newspaper in the UK, or did you have any plan?
No, newspapers then was a despised profession full of drunks and layabouts.
It isn't now.
Yeah, so
what are you talking about?
No, it was really
much loved.
It was a really despised, and it was the last resort of the alcoholic on the way down. The New Zealand Herald. If you started off on the Daily Herald, you'd end up on the New Zealand Herald at some point. And some very distinguished people did pass through New Zealand. Geoffrey Moorhouse was a great favourite of mine. But people read us. They had effectively no other real source of news. Even radio in the 50s wasn't operative as a news source. The BBC was, but not New Zealand radio. And television barely existed. I mean, there were programs, but you would laugh if you saw them now.
So when was it you made the trip to the UK to?
Well, I did what everybody did. I just saved up enough money to pay my fare, and I got on a ship and sailed here. It took a calendar month, And I can tell you with confidence that I arrived on February the 3rd, 1961, so it'll be 50 years in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And I had no ambition other than to join the newspaper. And I had imagined that if I was lucky, I'd get a job with Reuters right away and do a bit of agency work, because that's quite tough. This is following stories and filing every half hour. And what's more, filing short stories too, which is much harder than writing long stories. I had all these ambitions, but things changed. Although there were plenty of opportunities in October 1960, then 5 national newspapers closed down. The Reynolds News, the Chronicle, the Star, the Graphic and the Dispatch all closed. And when I arrived in London, there was nothing for me, except I eventually got a job on a journal called Fishing News, which also published Fish Selling and Self-Service Times, which was a paper devoted to roll plugs and adjustable shelving for the new but not yet happening supermarkets. This was for the trade press, and one group of trade press papers were owned by the Ben family of Wedgwood Ben fame. One was owned by Michael, we still hate the man, Heseltine, and one was owned by a man called Arthur J. Hayway, who had the World's Press News as well, which is where we found our job, so I thought it would be a good idea to work for him.
No, it's a well-worn path to go into trade newspapers. Any journalist here probably has been on a trade newspaper at some point. It's a sort of training ground. Now, but the thing is, there is competition amongst these magazines and newspapers for possibly the wrong reasons, not just about stories, but also the worst thing you have to do. The biggest problem in each of their particular industries. You've got a great tale about one-upmanship in this front.
Yes, so it wasn't a happy career, because one of the things I had to look after on Fish Selling, for instance, was Fish Fryer of the Month. And well, it didn't matter which fish fryer it was, they always used the best beer batter. Of course, they swore by North Sea cod, and they wouldn't use anything other than King Edward potatoes, and they fried everything in beef dripping. So after that, there wasn't a lot to talk about. Self-Service Times was even more desperate, because it was where I learnt layout. I actually learned all aspects of newspaper production, and I'm very grateful to have done it. But you imagine the problem of laying out a newspaper when your pictures all involve shelves. And they can be either somebody drilling a hole to put a roll plug in to maintain a bracket with a shelf that already has tins on it, or they can have a smiling girl putting baked beans on the shelf. But in every instance, the picture will always be a shallow horizontal. That's what a shelf looks like. And if you wanted, because we had standards, we wanted excitement and drama even in Self-Service Times. And so I had a terrible time trying to find ways of making the pages look different from each other, and indeed the next issue different from the last one. We were very badly paid, and we were appallingly paid. And what's more, we used to spend it on beer on Friday nights anyway, so there wasn't much left. And it became a practice, it's called ligging now, but then it was just called survival, to go to product launches. Of course, you were in the trade press, you were continuously invited to them, and you could be sure of calories in the supply of really hideous vol au vents, usually made of pastry and sweet corn for some extraordinary reason. And the wine would always be Blue Nun or Liebfraumilch, but really sickening. But nevertheless, it was actually energy in bottled form, and we would go for it, and then we wouldn't have to buy food. We'd be able to go to the pictures or the theatre or drink. And all the journalists would recognise each other and start comparing notes and actually asking if there are any good jobs anywhere. And I met this rather miserable customer who said, "What do you work for?" And I said, "Oh, I work for the worst journal I've ever come across, which is Self-Service Times. It's a hideous journal. On every page there's a picture that just goes like that. Imagine the drama, the next page like that, the third page like that, and right through to page 24. And he said, "Sounds all right to me." He said, "Every page I do, pictures like that. Next page like that. Next page like that." And he went on at length right through the whole run of the paper, trying to explain to me how you made features with a single, he made the features pages look different with a single column picture going all the way down the page. And in the end I said to him, who do you work for? And he said, the Zip Fastener. And it was then that I realised that there is always someone worse off than you. However horrible your job, someone has a worse one.
How many years did you spend on self-service weekly and the Fish News before you ended up on the National?
No, there was a slightly checkered career in that I had I actually threw it up and decided I would become a poet, and worked for Joe Lyons. Margaret Thatcher was a fellow employee at the time, and I packed frozen foods for 2 years and tried to write poetry and sent it off to journals that published poetry. Never got anything published. And then I met my wife and decided I'd better actually get a job, because it seemed like I was going to have a problem on my hands if I didn't. And I went and worked for the Hull Daily Mail as a shipping reporter and covering the trawler fleet, which of course then had 120 trawlers, that many of them which burnt coal, fished over the side. And it was where I probably reported on more death in that job than certainly anything else. As a science correspondent, you don't do a lot of death, funnily enough. But you could have trawlers going down at any time in Hull, and then someone would come along and give you a list of names and addresses and say, just give the company welfare officer 20 minutes and then you start after him, go around in that order. So you'd actually rush up to somebody's house, knock on the door, see somebody crying and think, God, thank God I've come to the right place. And then just say, oh, I'm from the Hull Daily Mail, I'm dreadfully sorry to disturb you at a time like this, but can I have a picture? And, tell me about your husband's career. And this is called, of course, battling on private grief, but funnily enough, it happens all the time in newspapers. And the other extraordinary thing you discover is that nobody ever slams the door in your face and says, go away and do not intrude. They always want to talk. Shall I launch into a story?
Please do.
At one of them, this is true. On the Hull Daily Mail, we tried to make a living by selling the more dramatic stories to the Express and the Mail, and because we were in the associated group. And I came to one house where there was a young woman and two young children crying, and an older woman trying to comfort her. And I thought, thank God, the neighbour. And I actually introduced myself to the neighbour and said that I really didn't want to disturb, upset people, but I had to have a photograph and a little bit about the man's career at sea. And she said, oh, I know where his sea book is, I'll go and get it. And she rushed upstairs. I came downstairs with the sea book, which contained the picture that I needed, and all the information that I needed about his seagoing career, because people would be ever so cross if their names were left out of the Hull Daily Mail. The relationship between a paper and its readers was always a very strange one. She came down, she told me everything, and then just as I was about to leave, I thanked her, and she tried to back away, making the kind of anxious apologies. And she suddenly said, just a minute, she said, he knew he was going to die, you know. And I said, really? And she said, yes, he always took his little dog to sea with him, and we were walking down to the trawler, and the dog was gambling along by his feet, and then suddenly, the dog, as he got to the gangplank, the dog gave a shriek and ran away and wouldn't come back. And he turned to me, she said, and said, I reckon this will be my last trip, love. The insurance documents are in the shell case on the mantelpiece. And then he went on board the ship and it went down. Went down off Greenland. I believe it was one of the ships that iced up and they couldn't de-ice, so the ship became too heavy and toppled over. And in the winter in those waters, your survival is about 30 seconds or maybe a minute. But there's no, once you're wet, you're not likely to ever survive. So it was a grim and horrible story, but here I was being told something that sounded as though it had been composed for the Daily Express. I mean, she spoke it as though it would read in the Daily Express. The only thing she didn't do was put my husband brackets 49, which is what they used to do in those days. And I listened in astonishment, and then I said, but why did he say this to you? And she said, why wouldn't I? I'm his wife. And then I said, well, who's that? And she said, oh, that's his girlfriend. And I suddenly realised I had once again stumbled into some sort of world in which had been composed by J.B. Priestley or Albert Camus or something as well, that everything that you report provides you with the material for a novel. And of course, there are a lot of journalists actually became playwrights and novelists, especially from that generation.
Now, zipping forward maybe a decade or so,
Yeah.
you end up at The Guardian, and you're writing about film, the arts, you're editing letters. Was that, to some extent, this is where you thought you fitted naturally?
I wanted to be a film critic. I mean, I was, in fact, fortunately, the Guardian. I mean, for 5 fortunate years, I was the Guardian's deputy film critic and actually had the most wonderful time.
What were some of the most awful films you saw?
Oh, well, you don't remember. Well, the most awful film I saw was called Mondo Erotico, which was so awful. I mean, it had nothing about it. I mean, I sat there reading an interview with Albert Finney, and I heard the telegraph man snoring behind me. And at one point, I got up and I started to walk out, saying I wouldn't watch this if you paid me. And somebody said, "But you are being paid." So I slunk back shamefacedly. There were some terrible films, but I was very lucky. I got to review Tarkovsky and the young Spielberg.
You met Tarkovsky?
I met Andrei Tarkovsky, yes, and that is one of the high points in my life. Although it can't have been very high because the translator didn't turn up, and the only person who could then translate was his minder from the KGB, whose English was not that good either. So it was a clumsy and laboured discussion, and. But I got a story out of it, and he did actually say something quite graceful and courteous about how he hadn't expected the Western media to be so pleasant. And I thought, well, that's nice. I really, you know, we're usually ashamed at nice words from the people we interview, but not in this case.
Now, we could fill a whole hour with just listing names of the people, the famous people you met. I mean, one part of journalism I've always sort of enjoyed or sort of thought about before I even started was this idea of meeting people you've always wanted to meet. And I know that, for example, one of the people that you've always wanted to meet and you did meet was Primo Levi, one of the greatest writers about science and culture and all sorts of things. Tell us a bit about what he was like.
He was remarkable. That was the most extraordinary thing, was that he was exactly like his books. If you read, especially the periodic table, which is the one that I had first read, he had, of course, already written If This Is a Man and The Truce, and they'd been published in the 60s, but they'd bombed. For some extraordinary reason, nobody wanted to know about the Second World War at the time, and it was only after I read the periodic table, I rang up Penguin and said, "Have you got these books left?" And they said, yeah, I've got loads of them. And so they sent me If This Is a Man and the Truce, and I gulped them down and then said, "You should be printing more now." And they didn't. They sold it to Abacus. He was immensely courteous. But it was one of those people, you often meet them who you wouldn't actually ask, you wouldn't waste time asking stupid questions because they're not the sort of people you should ask stupid questions of. I tried to talk to him about the two cultures debate, which is a feature of English life. And by the way, this is where I actually take out this flag and say, but I'm a New Zealander. I don't have the problem that a lot of English people do about science and arts. I don't think there are two cultures. I tried to talk to Primo Levi about this, and he rather mildly pointed out that Dante, before he became a poet, was a member of the Florentine Society of Physicians and Apothecaries, and if there was a branch of science in the medieval world, then he was a scientist. I also noticed, by the way, that there have been 2 scientific papers based on Dante's Inferno, one on Galilean invariance, because he seems to have anticipated it in one of the cantos, and another, which I haven't been able to access, on how he knew about the constellations in the south, because, of course, Magellan at that point hadn't sailed around the world. And I am very fond... Now, shall I bore you with this? I'm very fond of Dante. he in the penultimate canto of Inferno, which you've all read, of course, he actually anticipates Newton by 300 years and describes the strange business of meeting Satan, who's fast in the ice, right at the depths of hell, in a journey. You've all read the Inferno? Okay, you haven't. It's a topographical book. It actually describes a journey from the surface of the earth on the northern hemisphere down to the centre and then straight on to the Antipodes and the Mount of Purgatory. I don't have to do Catholic eschatology as well, do I? No. Okay, you know about hell and purgatory. He gets to the pit of hell and he finds Satan fast in the ice, because cold, of course, was one of the great pains as well, with 3 heads, one of them devouring Cassius, one devouring Brutus, and one devouring Judas Iscariot permanently. Virgil, his guide, says, we're going to climb down to get past this, and Dante is a terrible coward, so he closes his eyes and clings onto Virgil's back, rather like a rucksack, and finds himself going down the side of Satan, very hairy beast, being lowered down. Then suddenly realizes that something has happened. When he gets to the hip bone, Virgil turns around and starts climbing back up again. And he thinks, oh no, we've got to go all the way back through hell. But he hasn't. He opens his eyes and he can see Satan's legs sticking up in the air. That is, here's a medieval artist profoundly committed to a geocentric creation with all the spheres of heaven, who understands that there is a point at which down must become up. And it's not a general region, it's a place that has to be there. And this is something that we have to wait for 350 years for Newton to actually put this into arithmetic. But a poet has actually understood this just by thinking systematically about the nature, about the demands of his poem. That was a very profound discovery, that thinking is what scientists do. It's not just knowing or experimenting, they actually think. And so it's worthwhile asking them what they think, because sometimes they'll tell you.
Can you identify the first science story you wrote?
I'm ashamed to say that the first one I wrote was about Stomoxys calcitrans, the biting stable fly, but I didn't think of it as a science story. It was just an agricultural economic story, because this little beast bites cows in cow sheds, and of course then they don't produce milk. And in New Zealand, which lived off dairy farming and had 90 million sheep and 3 million people, the agricultural economics was a very important thing. So we didn't think of that sort of thing as science. There was that. I was on the letters page when there was a tsunami that actually killed a reported 30,000 people in Indonesia, and it turned up as about 3 paragraphs of Reuters agency, because of course there were no censuses. There were no maps. This was a funny world in which countries didn't even have their own maps. Right up into the 70s, the maps of Nepal were actually put together by mountaineers, coming back afterwards and telling the Royal Geographical Society. And since I couldn't write about what the tsunami had done to the Philippines and Indonesia, I just decided to try and find out what a tsunami actually was. So I went to the science library, which was only up the road from the Guardian, which was then in Gray's Inn Road, and it was in Chancery Lane, and borrowed some Scientific Americans, and was rather startled to find that the tsunami was a really exciting thing. That was a wave that covered the entire ocean column, and its speed was proportional to its depth. So that in the open ocean, where which is really deep, it generates something like 500 miles an hour. 500 miles an hour. But if you were on a boat in the deep ocean, you wouldn't even notice it, because at the most it's only a metre, and it would just whiz under you and you wouldn't feel it. And you'd only notice when, of course, you got to the shallow and it started to pile up. But we know about that now, but we didn't at the time. So I was quite pleased to have done my tsunami homework quite early on. But I was still then on the letters page. And it was, while I was looking after the letters page, not formally as letters editor because I'd been promoted, that I got opened a letter from the Royal Society, which said, "Dear Sir," to the editor, "will you please report to the Royal Society at 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening and explain why you cover science so badly?" And I didn't show it to the editor because I knew what would happen. Later on I met Peter Collins, I think, and said, "Did he know anything about that letter?" He said, "Yes, he did actually. It was by the Committee for the Public Understanding of Science." And I said, "Do you know what editors do at 7 o'clock at night?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, they're getting the paper out." He said, "Do you work at night?" And then I realised that there was actually a cultural problem in which not only did journalists not particularly understand science, but science didn't understand journalism at all. And so I had a tiny little part in the founding of COPUS by inviting the committee to come and see a newspaper produced. Things started from there.
Now,
You were going to say what's...
you can ask my question.
Oh yeah, I was going to answer your
Go on.
question. Now
Ask
the story. Okay, I'll be very quick. No, and I'll spin this one out. The story that made me want to become a science correspondent, not an arts correspondent. Nothing wrong with being an arts correspondent. When you ring up a poet and say, "Give me a glib quote about Mrs. Thatcher's arts funding policy," he doesn't say, "Well, I'm hardly the right poet to give you a glib quote, old boy. You need to go to..." You got the answer. If you went to an actress and said, "Oh, we need you for a photograph, and by the way, how do you feel about slimming?" She doesn't say, "Well, I know nothing about slimming. It's not my field, you understand." Whereas, of course, if you go to a scientist and ask a question, you're quite liable to be fobbed off by somebody who's saying, "Well, didn't you read my paper in Nature of Geoscience 5 years ago in which I dealt finally with this question?" That's how it was, by the way, once upon a time. I used to read New Scientist. I read New Scientist, New Statesman, and New Society because you could buy them as a package. Walt will remember this. And New Society had Angela Carter as a reporter, so there was a very good reason for reading that. New Scientist had an absolute wonderful star cast, and of course New Statesman was the magazine you had to read. So I read them as a package, and I was always enjoyed New Scientist, but then I suddenly saw this extraordinary story about a little mole that lived in South Australia, a marsupial mole that spent all its life alone because, of course, there's just no food in the Simpson Desert. And if you're living off worms, there aren't going to be worms for two. There's only ever going to be worms for one. But sooner or later in its life, this mole would meet a female worm. This mole would meet a female mole. And life being as exiguous as you'd expect in the South Australian desert most of the time, the courtship wasn't prolonged. In fact, there was none of this, come up and have dinner sometime, or have you seen my etchings? There would be the both moles knew what was required of them and got on with it immediately. And then this is where nature's played its cruelest trick. Of course, to survive, the one thing a pregnant mole lady didn't need was a male mole around there. So the moles that survived, the moles whose genes survived were the ones who didn't. And it became a feature. Apparently, this was reported in the New Scientist at the time, and it's been revised since then, but this is then. The mole's act of love would actually engender a cascade of hormones that would end up with death and oblivion at the most exciting moment. So just while the mole was filling his lover's tiny little pouch with progeny, he would have a massive heart attack and fall off dead. And I can remember thinking, this is the worst case of post-coital tristesse I've ever come across. But what impressed me most was the New Statesman's headline, which simply said, "When a mole's had it, he's had it." And it was then I realised that science actually gave you this fantastic canvas, and this is the important thing I have to say. It gives you this wonderful chance to write stories that have never been written before. This is such a privilege that you should never dismiss it. I did answer that question.
You did eventually,
yeah.
didn't you? I only asked a simple question. It turned into a beautiful monologue. But you did say, you have said before that you were dragged, kicking and screaming, from the arts pages to science. Just deal with that quickly before we go on. But what was it? What were you worried about?
Well, the kicking, no, I wasn't worried. The kicking and screaming. The arts page of The Guardian at the time was the most fabulous job. What other job in the world could you have where you pick up the phone and a voice would say, "This is Bernardo Bertolucci," and then you say, "Oh, you're kidding," and slam that phone down. And they'd go, no, it is Bernardo Bertolucci. Tom Stoppard used to ring up. In fact, Tom Stoppard was actually invited to play for The Guardian's cricket team, but he chose to play for Harold Pinter instead. You had playwrights sort of wandering in and saying, "Hi, Tim," or not, actually it wasn't me mostly, it was Derek Malcolm or Mike McMahon or other people on the arts page, but you know, I used to say afterwards that I'd been kissed by Trevor Nunn and called darling by Dickie Attenborough. What more could I live for? And of course you got tickets. People used to ring up and complain if you didn't go to their show. This is true. The Royal Opera House rang up and said, I've got a word with you. And I said, I'm awfully sorry about the tickets, because we had 5 critics wanted to go to the entire ring cycle. Imagine what that costs in ticket prices, when only one of them is going to write for the Guardian. But all 5 music critics of The Guardian wanted to see the entire ring cycle. And then Covent Garden rang up and said, why hadn't I been? And the answer was, I hadn't dared. I mean, it just seemed to be too much to ask for. But they said, no, we're very offended. You really ought to come along and see it. So I had to go and sit through the bloody ring cycle.
It was the late 80s when you became the science reporter, science editor. And you often tell of a whole crew of young journalists that came through. Roger Highfield, Ted Neild, and so on. I mean, all these people, did you know that these people would then become the next generation of science reporters? Did you see something in them?
Oh, well, I saw something in them in the sense that if they rang up a second time, I would say, oh yes, tell me more. I mean, Roger Highfield, I can confidently rang up with a story about dentures for sheep. Sheep, of course, we New Zealanders knew this anyway. Sheep tend to abrade their teeth rather horribly when they get to after 6 years of eating grass, which is why their lives are so short, because they can't actually crush the cellulose to digest it. But Roger came up with this mad story about dentures, and I thought, oh, that's the kind of science I like. I can't tell you about Peter Aldiss now, and I can dimly remember Ted Neild. I mean, Ted Neild's stories. The names were well enough known. In the end,
Is that your tip then? If someone calls you twice, that's the thing to do for recognition.
If you're put off by a no, you shouldn't even be in journalism. No is the first answer you're going to get ever. Don't ever be put off by the word no. Just ask again. Just persevere. You don't actually need talent. You don't even need to be able to spell or write. You just need perseverance in this job. As every sub-editor who's ever lifted a pencil knows, there are some terrible journalists around who are saved by their colleagues on a nightly basis. Isn't that true? I mean, even in the most distinguished journals like The Economist, this is sort of true. There's always somebody who actually has to be rescued.
Now, that was the late 80s. During the 90s, early 2000s, as a science editor at The Guardian, you were covering all sorts of stories which have become part of the history of science now. The sequencing of the first genome, the big Frankenfoods debacle with GM crops. And you've obviously been there at those moments. And how has the reporting and the relationship between scientists and journalists changed in that time?
Well, thanks to Mrs. Thatcher, it changed quite dramatically. But in the late 80s, no, in the late 70s, when you spoke to a scientist, you got a sort of a top-down and slightly dismissive response from people who thought that you weren't going to print it anyway, so why was he even wasting his time telling you? And then, of course, the Tories turned up. They took a hard look at science and academic work, and then decided that if people wanted science, they should pay for it themselves, like opera, really, and started closing down science all over the place. We had science ministers who would claim, no, they would boast. They might even be boasting true, that more money was being spent on science than ever before. But as some of us will remember, it was being spent paying off whole teams of scientists and closing down laboratories and institutions, rationalising it was called, selling off the family silver it was sometimes called. In one of the scandals of the 80s, the government closed down the National Engineering Laboratory and then paid the German firm of Siemens £2 million to take it away. Siemens sold the site for 20 million. That wasn't an answer to your question, but what it indicates is that at some point in the 80s, science itself decided that it had to go out and speak up for itself. And we did get immediately a sort of teams of volunteer scientists who actually turned out to be very, very good at talking to the press. They became, we call them media stars. We said they had the media gene. And this is, you know, it is true that there are people who are perfectly comfortable with this, who understand that we don't really want to know what a mitochondrion is. We just want to know how we can get away without using the word if we can possibly do it. And that's been the feature, for my money, that's been the feature of the biggest change in science, is that once upon a time, the science editor of the Times and the science editor of the Guardian thought they were writing for scientists. Scientists were a constituency, like lawyers, who would, of course, buy the Times for its law reports. But the story about the marsupial mole, by the way, is a serious one. I actually just thought that was so extraordinary that it was impossible not to share it with people. It would be ridiculous not to share it with people. And in that story were some amazing things that you hadn't realised before, that evolution, for instance, is a directing force. And you can see from the story how it works, why moles that kick the bucket when on their first and last occasion of lovemaking would be more likely to leave their genes to posterity, because, of course, the children wouldn't survive in competition with an adult mole.
Now, Tim, one of the things that you were at The Guardian covering at the time was when genetic modification and genetically modified crops and those sorts of things came to Britain. This was a time of all sorts of promise for this technology. It could, you know, feed Africa. It could feed all sorts of things. However, the media reaction was unbridled hostility.
No, it was not at first. That's just the odd thing. We had been writing. We would go to the British Association every September, and we would, at every time, we would file a story about the Golden New Dawn, in which we would be able to harvest spider silk from bats and make bulletproof vests from it, from which we would actually be able to grow plastics. You'd have potato fields in which you'd pick the tubers out, and then you'd harvest the crop, and you'd throw the crop into a fermenter, and it would actually produce the feedstock for the chemical industries. All of these things were reported, and 4 products made it to the British market. One of them was a vegetarian cheese. That is, the cheese itself had been precipitated by a rennet that was produced by genetically modified organisms, and then there was the other one was a tomato, a tin of tomato puree, which we went down to not I, but someone else on the news desk took down to Le Gavroche and invited Albert Roux to use instead of real tomatoes. And he apparently said, "Oh, it's not bad actually. You know, I could imagine myself buying it."
Well, my point is that during that time, when there was hostility for things that were genetically modified in let's call them down market tabloids, you said something quite interesting. Which was that, well, looking back on it, you said this, at least I think you said it, I'm hoping you said it because I've got it written down somewhere, which is that the scientists weren't really talking. They thought that if everyone just understood the potential of this stuff, then everything would be okay, we'd be allowed to have this stuff. Unfortunately, it never got past any sort of serious commercial application in this country because of that hostile reaction. And you said at the time that it was the best time for genetic modification scientists to talk about their work and get it into the newspapers. Now, do you think the attitude of scientists then, which was let's just shut up about this, has changed on controversial issues?
Yeah, the most conspicuous example was the decision to try and actually introduce embryo stem cell therapy, which was a, well, you could say it was a plot hatched by a tiny cabal of embryo stem cell scientists, because there weren't many, of course, who then proceeded to enlist the ear of the press, we're very good at actually listening if people ask us to listen, who then lobbied Parliament, who actually introduced a series of public debates and aired the issue quite openly before they introduced it. Whereas, of course, what went conspicuously wrong with genetically modified crops was a thing called the Novel Foods and Processes Advisory Committee, which summoned us all in 1988 and had a press conference and said, we've been looking at genetically modified crops and we've decided they're substantially the same as ordinary crops, so there's no need to actually say on the tin what's in here. And besides, it would be such a nuisance for big firms like Monsanto. And I can remember writing a story for the news desk saying that, that a government agency committed to transparency has just decided that you don't deserve to know what's going on. But I didn't suggest that there was anything dangerous about this stuff. I just wrote that. And my own paper was so bored by the subject it spiked it. And it was nearly a year and a half before the episode suddenly, you might say the community was ambushed by Friends of the Earth, because there were several aspects to the public revulsion, which were clearly, people were being played as if on an orchestra. But nothing I've actually heard about Monsanto since then has ever persuaded me that the British public were wrong to reject them. There's no reason why very large corporations should own the entire world. You know, you have to try and find a way of stopping Walmart owning everything. This is what democracy is for. And to get serious for just a moment, that's what journalism is for. We're really here defending democracy, and we do it in our little different ways. So science correspondents can do that too.
Now, I'm going to come to the audience for questions, 'cause I'm sure you have lots, but I'm going to ask just one more thing before we do that, which is that, when you started journalism, you were talking about hot metal, you were talking about the physical processes of getting newspapers out. Now it's all electronic, it's all digital. We're in a very different time. We have different media, people are doing their own thing. There are blogs, there are newspapers making audio programs, there are, the BBC has text-based services, all sorts of things. Now, I'm just wondering, do you think it's a better media now, or just a very different one? And how do you respond, how do you react to things like blogs? I mean, do you read blogs?
I intermittently do look at blogs. I do it with increasingly less enthusiasm because A, there are so many, B, you don't know who the blogger is. In some cases you do, of course. And in some cases it doesn't seem to me that they're any better than the kind of journalism that I thought I used to write. Now this is, it's not arrogance that makes me say that. It's the fact that when you write for a newspaper, you don't just have to persuade yourself that you've got it right. You have to persuade the people who are going to print it. That is, the sub-editors and the people on the backbench and the editor and your colleagues. And so funnily enough, I'm very fond of pointing out that journalism and science are remarkably alike. That is, you identify a problem and you frame a hypothesis and you go looking for the evidence and you actually write a paper and then you submit it for peer review and then it gets published. What's the difference? The difference is that in a newspaper, of course, this happens in 24 hours, whereas in science it takes as long as it takes. But that's not the important difference. The difference is that you can publish a scientific paper and people only need to read the abstract or the press release. I'll tell you the story if anyone pleads with it, but it's widely known that most scientific papers are read by the author and his mother, if he's lucky. And that's it. Whereas, of course, if you wrote for a newspaper and nobody read it, you've lost yourself a job. You have to be read. You have to be read by a large number of people, and that's one of the reasons why actually journalism's worth trying to get right. because not only it's as if you'd attended a tutorial or a seminar and then you'd written the essay, and the next morning it's going to be marked not only by the person who gave you the tutorial or conducted the seminar, but also by 500,000 other people who all know your name and where to get you and who expect a standard anyway. So there is a sort of the discipline that's imposed by broadcast journalism, mass journalism, is actually quite satisfying in a way, whereas I find the blogosphere of sometimes very stimulating and sometimes exasperating. But the only blog that I habitually go to is Tracker, the Knight Ridder Tracker, which of course keeps me abreast of all the things that Alok's up to as well.
You don't read our blog, you mean?
What?
Is that what you're saying? Yeah. What's that? That's a shocker.
I read the Guardian website, but the Guardian website is actually carries the Guardian brand, and is actually it's sifted and filtered by a college of journalism that I'm used to. That's not hard to understand.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask the audience for questions. If you raise your hands and just wait for the microphone, there are some coming up. So let's go at the front here, and then everyone else on that side. Would you tell us who you are?
Tristram Wyatt. Tristram Wyatt. I like the way that you commented on the two cultures, but I seem to remember your valedictory piece in The Guardian when you left being science editor was something along the lines of, you were tired of trying to write something about science that was as if you were writing politics when you had to explain who a prime minister or what a prime minister was every time. So how do those two things match, and do you think things are getting any better or worse?
We are, I can confidently answer that because I noticed it myself. We are getting better. Between 1988 and 2001, every time I used the words DNA, I added the suffix, the four-letter code of life, and then according to the occasion, I would then add another suffix explaining what the code of life was supposed to do. And then suddenly, about 2003, I noticed that I wasn't actually saying what DNA was. I was assuming at last, nearly 20 years after Colin Pitchfork. Does anyone need to be told who Colin Pitchfork is?
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe everyone. Okay. After 20 years after Adam Jeffries actually made the front pages of the world with the use of DNA to catch a criminal who could not have been caught by any other means, I didn't need to explain what it was. Now, people are actually quite... people are excused for not knowing facts. In journalism, that's what we do. We tell them what they need to know, and to an extent, we decide for them what they need to know, which is arrogant. But what else is there? You know, can you think of a better idea? Well, we don't insult their intelligence. So I've always assumed that the reader's intelligent, but he just doesn't actually know what mitochondria are, and I think this is true of most journalists, actually.
My own word is stem cells. We used to have to explain that 7 years
Yes.
ago. Now we don't.
Yes.
So we used to have to say stem cells, comma, the master cell that can turn into any organism.
Yeah, exactly.
Now we don't have to do that anymore.
Yes. But actually, even political journalists actually say things like Mr. Cameron, the Prime Minister, because there's always some old lady who thinks that Mr. Thatcher is still the Prime Minister.
Another question, please. Yep. Bob, anyone over here?
Bob.
Hi, Tim. What's the story of which you're most proud and why?
That's quite hard to say because the things you're proud of actually vary from day to day. One of the things I am hugely proud of, and I regard it as still the golden privilege, which is matchless. Nobody else will ever do this again. Was in 1977 when we invented a whole country, a completely fictitious country, and wrote a 7-page advertising supplement about it with real advertising paid for at enormous expense by J. Walter Thompson, about a country called Sanzarife, which was populated by Portuguese colonists who were known as colons, half-castes, of course, who were semicolons, and a native population who were called flongs. And the flongs, of course, were the papier-mâché mould that you pressed on the hot metal before you made a plate, which would fit around a roller. And the then science correspondent was given the job of explaining why it wasn't on the map. And of course the answer was because it was in a tidal current which was sweeping sand from the eastern end of the island round to the western end of the island. And of course the tidal current is a constant force, so this thing was constantly accelerating under Newtonian mechanics, and had now reached 30 miles an hour and had a bow wave. Someone went down and photographed the doorman at the Ritz, and he became General Piker, the military dictator of Sancerre. And all of this was put together by people who were just roped into the secret. And we published it on April the 1st, 1977, and even the Times wrote a front-page story about it. The Today programme couldn't survive without covering it, so they actually invited the High Commissioner for Sancerre to appear on. His name was, he was the brother of Sir Crispin Tickell, Tom Tickell, who was a colleague of ours. They invited him to come along and do funny voices on the Today programme. And when I got into the office to pick up the letters page, the very first letter I saw was a printed letterhead from the Sancerre Liberation Front. And you know that you've actually hit a nerve. And for years and years afterwards, the map of Sancerre ended up in a British Museum exhibition. So that's one of the things I'm proudest of. The other thing I'm really proud of was going to Chernobyl and writing a piece that my colleagues wouldn't use. I used it on the science pages, so that was fine. But I'd rather thought it would have done as the cover of G2. And they didn't actually want it. But it just seemed to me to be crazy that 30,000 square kilometres of wonderful forests in the Ukraine should be completely sealed off and with barbed wire and patrolled by guards, as if in a Tarkovsky movie, Stalker in fact, which had already been made, of course, before Chernobyl, in which we had a wasteland in which there would be villages, wonderful little elegant wooden villages that dated from medieval times, which were actually glowing very gently in the dark, where all the plutonium dust had settled on the roofs, and where apple trees were climbing in through the windows of wooden houses, and it was so affecting, so moving, and so extraordinary that I couldn't stop myself writing the piece. That it wasn't quite. It was actually journalism in the sense that I had facts in it. But how do you turn the notion of digging up a forest and burying the forest in the forest? How do you describe that without getting a little bit carried away? Because, and when The Guardian came to do its millennial edition of all the great stories of the last 100 years, they didn't cover, none of the reporting from Chernobyl turned up. They just used this piece, which I thought was really nice of them. Anyway, that was one. That was
Took them a decade to recognise it. You're saying. Took them a decade to recognise it.
Yeah.
I've got some hope still. Some more questions, right at the back there, yeah. And
hi, I'm Andrew from the Science Communication course. Towards the end of the talk there, you touched on a couple of things like GM debate and stem cells. Do you think, as a science reporter, you have a duty to take sides in these things, or should you always stay very neutral and take that sort of position from now on?
When I left The Guardian, there was people talked about journalism with attitude. That is, you reported the facts, but you actually might nevertheless have an attitude to them. And this was always true, of course. When you said, how about thermonuclear war, is it a good thing? The answer is no, not really. Because you're not going to get the advertising, you're not going to get generally speaking, we have an attitude to thermonuclear war, and even though we try and report the Cold War fairly, giving attention to both sides of the debate, by and large we don't want Cold War. Do we want embryo stem cells? No, I thought that you're asking me a question about what was sometimes called yuck science, that is science that makes you go yuck. You don't have to be around in science for very long to realise that yuck is a very temporary, fleeting phenomenon. It's a little shiver of disgust which actually evaporates as soon as you find out more about it. And in the case, I got into journalism around about the time of the first heart transplant, which actually made everybody in the world go, yuck. And indeed, it didn't help the guy whose heart was transplanted either, because he was dead within a week, or was maybe a fortnight. But nevertheless, attitudes to organ transplant changed from that moment. They began to change, and of course, by the time I started covering science and medicine, there was already a surgeon scientist who had conducted a heart, lung, liver, and kidneys transplant. I mean, a bodyectomy, really. And people sort of said, "Oh yeah," you know, and took it rather calmly. Test tube babies were a big yuck thing when they first happened. Of course, as soon as they started delivering children that people really wanted, the public not only calmed down but rather embraced the technology. And this is true of almost everything that's been successful. So, open heart surgery, which is another thing, guaranteed to send a shudder down the, down a parental spine. The thought of your child being operated on while the heart was still beating. It works. Even though, if you've been to the Science Museum, you'll have seen the original apparatus, which involved some roof guttering and some packed ice, down which the blood came out of an artery, ran down the guttering, was chilled by the ice packed underneath it, and then fed back into the patient to slow the heartbeat down.
I suppose if I can add something to that question, which is you can definitely think to yourself that thermonuclear war is not a good thing, but do you say that in a news piece? How do you deal with that?
I've never had a problem with that one.
Maybe not that one then. Choose one of the other ones. The Guardian always did try to understand that there were two sides to a debate. But when an outfit called the Paedophile Information Exchange started writing letters to the press saying, well, why shouldn't people, adults, have loving and considerate relationships with children? I used to spike the letters. Fair enough.
There are questions which you just say to yourself, oh no, I am not going to be balanced and impartial on this one.
Okay.
But there's quite few.
Let's have a question at the back.
Hi. Thank you very much, Duncan Macmillan. It's a commonplace assumption that journalists have to be cynical, and hard-bitten, but you've always seemed to have an infectious enthusiasm and joy in what you write about. Do you think that has sustained you?
It's sustained me. This is a job in which if you were looking for disappointment, depression, exasperation, fury, and late nights, you can find it every night. I mean, there is no doubt that there are difficulties in working with a team of highly strung drunks and hysterical prima donna drunks, and and people called byline. I mean, there are lots and lots of people in journalism who you think to yourself, I don't really want to work with this man, but you have to. So there are difficulties. But just think of the privilege. You get a grandstand seat. You get the best seats in the theatre and the best seats in the House of Commons. You get to see everything. People come up and talk to you afterwards. People will actually come and say, well, I couldn't write a column, could I? People treat you as though you matter. The dangerous thing is to think that you do matter. You're not there for you. You're there for the reader. And that's the bit I found really sustaining, that actually we're doing this to be read. We're doing this so that someone can read us. We're doing this so that someone can read something that they ought to read, which includes science.
Okay.
Was that an answer?
There's a question over there. Right. And whilst the microphone's going up, I'll tell you that Tim might seem jolly and happy, but in the office he swore a lot, usually at the phone when he slammed it down. Or when the news desk told him to write something he didn't want to write, and he'd ring up various scientists saying, listen, I've been told to write some festering horse shit about something. Can you just help me out?
Human cloning.
This is all true.
There was a lot of human cloning going on for a while.
Just at the back.
Feel free to swear on this one. But I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the fact that it's more interactive now with readers, and as the web evolves, it's easier for anyone to chip in on your article and have their say and post comments.
So yes, this is interesting because you do write a column for us about the book, about books, and the people do comment. And
people do comment. And if people have something, there are two classes. There's the commentator. There's the one, whenever you use the words global warming, people will say, oh, not that shit again, and actually deliver a small stream of abuse, which indicates that they have no intention of actually looking at the evidence, and even if you actually took the evidence and force-fed it to them through any orifice that was available, they would still reject it because that's what they've decided to do. And this is quite a large fraternity, by the way. I don't mean just about global warming. I mean, there are people who think that there was a shameful contingent within British journalistic life that insisted for at least 5 years after everyone else that HIV was not the cause of AIDS. And some of us can name them, and perhaps will when they die. There are people who are convinced that this is very strange. They're convinced that Apollo 11 was a fraud, but that Apollo 12 and 14 really happened. And I've never understood that one. You get readers whom you are glad that they read the piece when after that hideous episode in the Mill Hill test clinic when they were testing drugs for safety, two patients fell gravely and extremely ill. I wrote a piece, an ignorant piece, just sort of describing what might have happened. And 3 biochemists actually immediately got on the web and started talking not to me but to each other about how it. And by I think within 45 minutes they'd come up with the machinery of that must have been overlooked in the original animal tests. And so I was profoundly impressed by what the readers can contribute. But of course you can also be pretty depressed by what the readers contribute when you read some of them.
Okay, we've got 5 more minutes, probably time for a couple more questions. So there's one here. Is there anyone on this side? So down here, please.
Louise Marston from Leicester. Do you think what makes a good piece of science journalism is essentially the same as what makes a good scientific paper or science blog or government report, or are there some things that are different?
No, I think that what makes a good piece of science journalism is a story. And a story is something that you can spend all your life trying to actually define, but you know it when you see it. You know it instantly. It gives you little prickles up the back of the neck. You can just know it's a story. And journalism is not, I mean, science journalism has no privileges. You can't write a boring, stupid story just because it's science and therefore people expect it to be boring and stupid. When people say, well, why don't you report science as a process? I say, well, okay, I'm going to walk up to the news desk and I'm going to say, I've got this really interesting piece of paper, a piece of Nature about small cell cancer in laboratory tests in vitro and subsequently in mice, which certainly point to an interesting direction for research, which may, in the end, pay off in human trials, but is unlikely, on balance, so far, to actually be a cure for cancer. I could go to a news desk and say that. And then, meanwhile, the sports editor, a sports reporter has walked up and said, here, the captain of the England team's been found completely off his face on strange substances on a traffic roundabout with 2 tarts and a minister. And you say, which one would you rather read? Actually, which one would you rather read? So when people say that there's a danger of hype, and of course Nature's press release actually warns me about hyping, I say the act of selection itself is an act of hype. If you are taking 10,000 pieces of research and picking one of them, what are you doing to it? You're imbuing it with a significance which is there because you're writing about it. You've committed yourself to writing about it. You're going to have to make people read it. So you're going to turn it into a drama. You're going to turn it into something that gives someone a sense of pleasure or a sense of excitement or a sense of foreboding. That is, you're committing an act of sensational journalism. Of course you are. That's what you're there for. And if people say, so you're in the entertainment business then, can I point out that none of you have ever read Dostoevsky because it was boring. You read it because it was interesting. You read it because you liked Dostoevsky. That's why you read great books, because they're exciting and wonderful. You don't read them because they're good for you. And you don't read journalism because it's boring. You read it because it's exciting, and it's our job to make it exciting. All I ever wanted to do was to be read. I also wanted to be right, just in case any of you get me silly.
Question here.
It's Ruth Francis from the Nature Press Office, and we're very proud of that hype disclaimer, actually. Tim, in a sense, my question was to kind of draw out your stories about stories. You've written about a wide range of subjects, but you've also written in a wide range of formats, from columns to kind of brief news stories to reviews to full books. What do you prefer? Which format do you prefer? And
I honestly don't have a preference. It is I mean, lately I've been even been writing leaders, which is a rare art form, because most journalists won't read them. I mean, they see this unsigned bit that says The Guardian thinks, but on the other hand, and say, right, well, that's the one thing I don't need to read. I've even written those. There is no favourite format really. You respond. You do recognise that some stories lend themselves to one treatment rather than another. And I've just done you an entertainment about the marsupial mole, which couldn't really have been done in a nib, as we call it, in news in brief. It's a story that requires space. And you come across these things. Can I just finish with a little anecdote?
Please do.
I went to the Natural History Museum, which was always a favourite landfall of mine, because I never came away empty-handed, but I'd gone because Chris Stringer was mounting a little display about Neanderthal man, and I thought there must be a story here. Even though it was in the press release, I thought I'll go along and talk to him anyway. Neanderthal man was not a hulking brute. He was a sensitive metrosexual who actually had a Neanderthal health service and lots of caring aspects to his life, and was certainly as intelligent, and what's more, loved his children. So this was new, but I'd reported it anyway as it turned up in the archaeological finds, because archaeology is always a wonderful source of stories. But I thought I'd go along and talk to Chris anyway and see if I could get something better, and I did get something mildly better, and it made a nice picture story, which I was going to go back and write, and then I suddenly remembered that 24 sperm whales had been washed up on a beach in Stornoway, and I'd heard somebody say, perhaps scientists could have a post-mortem on a sperm whale and find out why it beached itself, which didn't seem very probable to me. But I did actually ask out loud in the private part of the Natural History Museum whether anybody had conducted a post-mortem on a sperm whale. And the door burst open, and in came this man who said, to conduct a post-mortem on a sperm whale, Tim, you need some good rubber boots, a Macintosh, a very long rope for climbing down a cliff, a chainsaw over your back because to open the bloody thing with, and some buckets to carry away your samples, because some of those tapeworms can be 24 feet long. And then he launched into this wonderful discussion, the most disgusting story I've ever heard, of the inside of a very dead sperm whale, all of which is wonderful copy. I mean, I made a 2,000-word feature straight away. I just came back and wrote 2,000 words for the science supplement. And I was very pleased with the outcome, but I wasn't allowed out of the room because Monica Grady, the meteorite expert, ankle tapped me on the way out and said, "No, come and look at this." And she took me in and she showed me a little piece of thin section microscope slide, which was a fragment from the skin of a European recoverable spacecraft called Eureka. It had been put up by Europe, sailed around the world for 3 years, and then brought down again very carefully by NASA astronauts with gloves aboard the shuttle, cut up into tiny pieces and sent to 100 universities, because people wanted to know what the space environment actually contained. And so what Monica Grady had been doing was counting the little bits of pitting, the abrasions, the scars in the skin of the spacecraft, to find out the average size of particles at 240 kilometres above our heads. But she hadn't just discovered a scar. She discovered a little patch of chemicals which, because they contained sugars and salts and ammonia, could only have been human urine. The headline, "Astronauts caught spending pennies from heaven," will suggest it instantly, but what had happened, didn't take long to work out, was that although the first American astronauts and cosmonauts wore diapers when they went up into space, as space journeys got longer and longer, this became a less practical thing to do. And so NASA came up with a thing called the post-nutritive substance disposal bag, or a plastic bag. And the Apollo astronauts and the Soyuz cosmonauts would actually, when they felt the need to evacuate, I'm not going to get specific here, would actually do so in a plastic bag and then seal it very carefully and then try and put it down somewhere, but there's no down in the spacecraft. So they had to work with the stuff either in the lunch box or floating around them and they went off the idea of that too. So as soon as extravehicular activity was invented, it became the habit to throw the trash out. Buzz Aldrin tells the story of actually doing stellar navigation on Apollo 11, and suddenly realizing that what he was taking a sight on was in fact couldn't have been a star because it hadn't been there before, and it was a bag of urine floating alongside the spacecraft only 50 feet away, but reflecting the sun's light so brilliantly that he thought it was a star. And this stuff was actually sailing round and round the planet at 17,500 miles an hour, freezing on the dark side and then expanding suddenly on the sunlit side because the temperature difference is 200 degrees. A terrible accident just waiting to happen. And it did.
Are there any other questions? No? Well, in that case, I've got one more to finish. And, the answer to this question is keeping these people between you and wine. So the specialism of science in newsrooms is actually relatively new. It's half a century old, if that, compared to politics and social affairs and all these which are more than a century, several centuries old. It's a specialism that's basically going through its teenage years. Every so often it's in crisis. We've had all sorts of discussions about whether it's being replaced by new media, etc. What is this job description of a science journalist for the next 50 years? What do they need to be doing? What do they need to grow up?
I would have to say, because I haven't grown up, that you just find stories and write them. That's the most enjoyable thing you can do. And of course, it's what you're paid to do. And what's more, you're sometimes given expenses to do it too. So there's plenty of reasons for doing it. But what's exciting about it is the stories themselves. I've told you some of them. As you can, obviously I've told them before and I've got quite used to it, but I actually love storytelling. It's just such a pleasure. It's, of course, it may be the activity that separates us from the rest of the creation, really, because animals communicate, but I don't know that they actually frame stories and then sort of tell them as well-I-never anecdotes. The answer is, I really don't know. I think that I was lucky to be around in the adolescent bit, certainly, because that's what I am, really. I have, in fact, passed the biblical 70 years and 10, but I don't think like that. I still think I'm 17, which of course is a ridiculous thing to think. But nevertheless, it's an attitude that you tend to have in journalism. You do tend to be frivolous rather than serious. Even those reporters who will stand solemnly on television and tell you how serious they are not necessarily that serious when they're off duty, as Walt will remember and vouch for. I think that there's a lot to explain, and I think that the difficulty of explaining is going to get harder and harder. Ruth's heard this story before. Well, you've all heard this story before. I once rang up the editor of Nature and asked him what one of his papers meant. I mean, I just read out an abstract to him and said, can you tell me what that means? And he said, no. And I said, can you tell me what discipline it represents? And he said, it was the duty editor, by the way, it wasn't John Maddox. He said, did I hear the word protein? Could it have been biology? that was, and of course, the point was that science is hard. If it was easy, it would be done by dilettantes. But it's not. It's done by PhDs, so it's obviously quite hard. And it's getting harder because, of course, each specialisation has gone further and further. And the sciences themselves are bifurcated. So you now have things like proteomics and glycobiology, which are specialisms with their own journals. And how is my mum supposed to keep up with that? The article that I read to the editor of Nature became the subject of the column, which I actually explained that science was difficult, so difficult that even the editor of a journal couldn't expect to understand everything in his own journal, and that anyway it had been proved by I think sampling research that most scientific papers were read by nobody, and you could tell this by the number of times the same mistake had been perpetuated in the citations. If somebody got the name of the citation wrong, it would ripple through the whole of science publication with the wrong citation, because no one ever went back to the original. And I suggested that nobody ever read these things except the author and his mother. And 2 weeks later, the author rang up, one of the 5 authors rang up from Canada and said I was really unfair. If I just rang him up and asked him, he could have told me what it meant in plain English. And I apologised and swore never to do such a cruel thing again. And then 2 weeks later, I got a letter written in ink that just said, "Dear sir, how dare you pick on my son."
And with that, I think, can we give Tim a round of applause, please?